There's a conflict bubbling beneath the surface as Germans head for the most important elections in decades. September's results will determine who will replace Angela Merkel as German chancellor. While it's true that the majority of voters will decide on who leads Germany into the post-Merkel future, there's a generational clash politicians simply don't want to talk about. Like never before, it's Germany's older generations, the 50-plus, who are calling the political shots. And while there is much talk of the future, those who will live through most of it, Germany's young, will have the least to say about it.
Also in Deutschland sinkt das Stimmgewicht der jüngeren Generation. Man kann sogar bald von einer Gerontokratie, von einer Herrschaft der Älteren sprechen, weil einfach das Übergewicht der Älteren an der Wahlurne inzwischen so ausgeprägt ist, dass die Jüngeren ihre Vorstellungen viel weniger durchsetzen können als noch vor 20 oder 30 Jahren.
I could have never imagined that kind of aggression and anger and frustration that was being directed at us, the younger generations who are just talking what the science has been telling for the past 40 years.
For those generations in the driving seat, this clash of interests often doesn't feel that way.
Von einem Krieg der Generationen, auch im Ansatz, habe ich nichts bemerkt, nichts gehört und nicht gesehen.
Quite a gap in perception between old and young, and right in the middle of that gap is where the political arena is set for the current election campaign. As politicians try to position themselves to succeed Angela Merkel, they all talk of the future. But at the same time, they all have to at least appear to be on the side of older voters. It's about the demographics. Soaring German birth rates created a peak in the 1960s, the age of the baby boomer generation. After that, birth rates plummeted. That makes this vote all about the age distribution. That peak and the cliff that came afterwards created very differently sized generations. The young groups are outnumbered by the old at a ratio of at least 2 to 1. When Germans go to the polls on September the 26th, voters over 50 will make up almost 60% of the electorate, while the under 30s will make up just 14.4%. All of this wouldn't matter if age had no effect on how people vote, but it does. The last EU elections showed older and younger voters pulling in different directions. There was a remarkable difference in generational support for the Green Party and Angela Merkel's Conservative bloc. And current polls suggest that this division will continue into this September's general elections. Among the under 30s, 36% are expected to vote for the Green Party. Just 16% are expected to vote for Merkel's Conservatives. Among the over 60s, it's almost a complete reversal, with 36% expected to vote for the Conservatives and just 14% expected to vote Green. And their preferences will matter more because they have millions more in terms of voting power. With half of the population heading towards retirement or already there, it's the grey Germans who hold the keys to the future.
Mal machen Sie denen keinen Vorwurf, die über 50 Jahre sind. Wir sind nun halt die Mehrheit. Also, in der Demokratie, es gibt nie keine Partei, die diese Altersgeneration vernachlässigt. Ich kenne keine, die überall auftreten. Die Welt ist nun so.
But we need protests on the streets because someone needs to interrupt this whole business as usual. Someone needs to step out of that comfort zone and say, this is not the way we can keep going. And even all the stories about, small improvements and small developments, they cannot overshadow how bad people in society have messed up. And so we need to ring this alarm bell, and I guess that works. That doesn't work that well usually when you're still, muddled up within the systems that maintain the business as usual.
But Fridays for Future can't change those numbers. Young voters will remain a minority for decades to come. And to make policy changes, you need a majority. That's democracy. And that's also how Angela Merkel explained why she failed to move faster on climate protection.
Wir als Politikerinnen und Politiker müssen dafür Mehrheiten finden. Das ist unsere Aufgabe. Und das ist manchmal nicht ganz so einfach, denn die bei Fridays for Future sitzen, sind ja für uns Antriebskraft. Das ist ja positiv. Aber sie sind halt nicht die einzige Meinung, die in Deutschland existiert. Und jetzt würde wahrscheinlich Luisa Neubauer sagen, da muss ich mich halt mehr anstrengen.
What would you say?
Well, I guess politics isn't about finding majorities, but about fighting for majorities. A majority doesn't just, pop up somewhere for some climate justice measure, but it's something you have to fight for. And I guess we need our leaders to be able and to be willing to fight for those majorities. That's democracy, but that's also the crisis we're in.
Neither the chancellor nor young voters can escape that generational divide at the ballot box. And it's creating disillusionment among the young.
Es gibt einfach viel weniger jüngere Menschen und Menschen von 0 bis 18 können ja auch nicht wählen oder bis 17. Das heißt, sie sind für die Parteien gar nicht entscheidend. Auf diese Menschen muss man nicht eingehen. Das heißt, es wird vor allem für RentnerInnen, also für jetzige RentnerInnen und für Eltern Politik gemacht.
Ich gehe davon aus, dass dadurch, dass junge Leute, also überwiegend ältere Leute wählen, wir immer noch nicht wichtige Dinge wie zum Beispiel Klimagerechtigkeit durchgesetzt bekommen.
So while the German political system is stuck in a gear comfortable for the baby boomer plus generations, time is ticking away for tackling the challenges that will mostly affect the young. The Fridays for Future movement helped prepare the ground for climate change becoming the hot-button issue of this election campaign. This summer's devastating flash floods left some 200 people dead and a €50 billion bill to rebuild what had been destroyed. The link to global warming and the fear of more disasters to come pushed climate change to the top of the political agenda. Yet it's still not clear whether voters will respond by choosing parties and policies that would mean tangible changes to their lifestyle.
But we need older generations to acknowledge that there is this price tag to all the development and the welfare and that everything that's been worked for. And we need people to kind of wake up to that. And when we started Fridays for Future, I thought we just had to remind older generations of what is happening around the world. And I thought we would just kind of go up and say, sorry guys, don't want to interrupt. Very quickly, there's a climate crisis and someone needs to start acting like we're in a crisis. And what happened was the most insane and most absurd fight back against us. Like the climate crisis was our fault just because we were talking about it.
A scientist herself, Angela Merkel was one of the first world leaders to raise the alarm on climate change, even traveling to Greenland in a stunt to call for action back in 2007. She was dubbed the climate chancellor early in her tenure. The crisis is not new territory for her, yet this year she had to admit she'd failed to meet her own ambitions.
An dem Ziel deutlich unter 2 Grad oder möglichst nah an 1,5 Grad Celsius Anstieg ist nicht ausreichend viel passiert. Das gilt nicht nur für Deutschland, sondern das gilt für sehr, sehr viele Länder auf der Welt. Und deshalb muss das Tempo angezogen werden.
But the policies in place to do that speeding up were not good enough. That's according to the Constitutional Court, which issued a landmark ruling that made waves around the world. The plaintiffs, some of whom are still very young, are seeing their liberties violated by irreversibly shifting the burden of saving emissions past the year 2030. Germany's climate policy was so unfair, it was unconstitutional, and that forced politicians to acknowledge two things. First of all, that there is this generational conflict, not just beneath the surface. and that future policy making without taking young people into account could see them before the courts. Jolted into action, Merkel's government shifted its CO2 neutrality goal forward by 5 years, bringing it almost in line with the Greens. A giant leap for Merkel's government, but a very small step compared to the demands coming from the streets.
But in the science, at least, in the last 30 years, it was clear that we would have needed such a change and such a transformation in all these sectors. And now it is like nearly too late. And that's why these elections in September are so relevant and so important.
Those elections have climate high on the agenda, pushed there by fires across Europe and floods in Germany. This summer's report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also underlined that urgency. Its more than 200 scientists predict the Earth will pass the 1.5 degree of warming mark by the 2030s, much earlier than previously predicted. And that even if we take drastic action now.
Es sind Fehler gemacht worden und jetzt muss man sehen, dass diese Fehler nicht nur korrigiert werden, sondern dass man auch in der Lage ist und den Mut hat, in der Politik einmal umzusteuern. Dann werden wir auch akzeptieren müssen, demnächst etwas mehr Opfer zu bringen.
Young people will be the ones who will have to build a future in the climate-changed world.
So in order to stay below 1.5, the future coalition would have to agree on a program that is more radical than any of the manifestos that were written before. That's kind of unlikely. So this election will impossibly lead us to be on a safe pathway to 1.5 degrees or prepare this plan. It can maybe provide this foundation that we need to then fight for 1.5, but it will need a lot of work, and that will be tough fights we'll have to fight.
What most parties have left open, though, is whether they will have the political stomach to confront those 50-plus generations with the sacrifices that will be needed to meet those new climate targets. The other crisis that is exposing Germany's generation gap is Corona. The entire country spent months in significant lockdown. It was an approach firmly based on scientific advice. Initially, Angela Merkel was hailed for her decisive action.
Wir sind nicht verdammt, die Ausbreitung des Virus passiv hinzunehmen. Wir haben ein Mittel dagegen. Wir müssen aus Rücksicht voneinander Abstand halten.
To this day, Germany has one of the lowest COVID death rates in the world. But opinions on her leadership are split depending on which age group you talk to.
Wie es gelaufen ist immer noch bewundernswert. Wie es letzten Endes auch noch gelaufen ist, sind wir auch mal zufrieden, dass wir so weit sind wie heute. Dass also alle Menschen können sich impfen lassen.
Before vaccines became widely available, successive lockdowns were Germany's main answer to fight the pandemic. And those closed schools and playgrounds, the cancelled apprenticeships and postponed training courses had a devastating effect on the young. The lockdown was to protect the old, but Germany's digital infrastructure failed to offer alternatives to the young. They felt like the big losers of the crisis.
Wir jungen Leute, wir haben in der Pandemie gezeigt, so wir können Dinge wegstecken, so wir wurden vom Staat extremst benachteiligt, so Schule, also der Staat hat die Wirtschaft gerettet, der Staat hat investiert in Wirtschaft, aber die Schule und die SchülerInnen, Studenten, Azubis wurden einfach so zurückgelassen.
Number one lesson from the corona crisis would be that there is a huge generational injustice that is being maintained and not being looked at enough. There were sweet moments of solidarity, of course, when younger people stayed inside to protect the older ones, when older people stood up and said younger ones need to have the right to go to school or to go to clubs or to have some kind of leisure activity moments. But all in all, what we saw how especially younger generations were just, drastically ignored a lot of the times.
So what happened? Why would Angela Merkel, the leader known for handling any crisis thrown at her, simply forget about the younger generation?
gilt ganz allgemein, dass man mit steigendem Alter risikoaverser wird, sicherheitsorientierter wird. Man sieht das vielleicht am Gegensatz zwischen Sebastian Kurz in Österreich und Angela Merkel in Deutschland. Kurz hat etwa in der Corona-Politik viel früher das Restrisiko in Kauf genommen. Er hat die Schulen viel länger offen gelassen als Angela Merkel. Und das gilt auch in allen anderen Bereichen.
As the German economy was hit by the lockdowns, the government borrowed billions to keep the country afloat. Now a €650 billion debt bill is infuriating those who feel their needs were neglected when schools and universities were shut.
We need generational justice, and the actual policies are not made for young people, they are made for old people.
And while football stadiums and concert halls are reopening, many schools still don't have a clear plan on how to continue classes in the face of a fourth COVID wave. The elections on the 26th of September will also decide on which group of society continues to have priority on getting their life back. And for the moment, it doesn't look like the young have moved up that list. Thirdly, I wouldn't be talking about generational justice without mentioning the P word. Pensions epitomize the very stability Germany stands for. Only Germany's pension system is just 4 years away from hitting a brick wall. Everyone knows it, but politicians don't want to talk about it because it would mean explaining to those majority baby boomer plus generations that they may be about to have a financial haircut. Pensions are the most obvious clash of interests between the generations. Over the next couple of years, that post-war baby boomer generation will start going into retirement pretty much all at once.
Wir waren zu viel im Kindergarten, zu viel in der Schule, zu viel im Studium, zu viele auf dem Arbeitsmarkt. Und wir werden zu viele Rentner und Rentnerinnen auch sein. Und entsprechend denke ich schon, dass die Politik sich da stärker darauf fokussieren sollte, diese Generation, die momentan ja noch sehr produktiv sind, sehr viel erwirtschaftet, dass sie sozusagen gerade auch was die Vorsorge, was das Rentendasein angeht, da mehr macht, als es bisher der Fall ist.
So while baby boomers are still expecting more, the pension system as it stands won't be able to fulfill those promises made in the past. The sheer numbers don't match, and whatever adjustment is made to soften the blow, a big hit is coming. As a system that still relies on more people paying in than getting anything out, tips over into more people receiving a pension than paying in. The latest government report warns of a shock-like effect only 4 years away. A German angst issue for politicians, which has left lawmakers paralyzed.
They're afraid of the young generation because some of them believe they will never get a pension because by then the pension system will be broke. They're afraid of the old person because they actually vote in masses and they don't want to have a reduction in their purchasing power of pensions. They are used to get a pension increase by 3-4% over the last 10 years, and now suddenly it should be only 1% or 0.
I have very mixed feelings about the pension debate. I see how my mom, for instance, who's been working for 40 years, isn't really expecting to get any pension she can live off, and she's a nurse and she's been working so hard, and it's a weird situation. And at the same time, you know, when we talk about pensions of my generation, I don't think the aspect of tax system will be our biggest problem in 2080. We will be somewhere else.
Germany's politicians aren't expected to solve the country's pension dilemma anytime soon. But whatever they do, they will need a majority from those about to retire.
I would love to see a baby boomer generation who says, okay, we are in different crises, in multiple crises at the moment, and we are kind of responsible for them, not on an individual level, but on a systemic level. And we are taking the responsibility, and as a whole society, together with young generations, with older generations, we are trying to make it, and we are trying to solve the social crisis and the climate crisis. and biodiversity and so on.
Democracies rely on majorities willing to bridge those gaps between generational interests and attitudes.
Weil die Jüngeren brauchen die Älteren. Sie haben die Schlüsselpositionen inne in den Medien, in Wirtschaft, in Politik. Das heißt immer so schön, den Jüngeren gehört die Zukunft, aber de facto gehört eben den Älteren alles andere. Und insofern brauchen wir eigentlich ein Bündnis zwischen den Jungen und den Alten.
With the power of the majority firmly in the hands of those baby boomer plus generations, younger Germans are set to continue their campaign on the streets way beyond those landmark elections in September. Outnumbered at the ballot box, they know that they will need those baby boomers to stand with them.
Well, it's an odd situation, of course, for younger generations, knowing that so many people will vote and decide about our future without having to live through that very future. So, yeah, we are not just talking about climate justice, but we're talking about generational justice. And we need to see that also within politics and political programs, the ability to take younger perspectives into account, even if they can't vote themselves yet.
Essentially, those under 30 today are at the mercy of the older generations. How and whether the post-Merkel government will address this will also give an indication on where Europe, the world's oldest continent, is heading. Whether it will focus on re-establishing the status quo or whether it will act in the interest of the future generations. These elections will show how much room there is for compromise.